Hi, this is Teddy, and today you're listening to Meagan Hatcher-Mays, Director of the Democracy Policy for Indivisible, on Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast Podcast Network. Stay home and save lives!
Hi, everyone. This is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast family of podcasts. And I'm on today with Meagan Hatcher-Mays, who is the Director of Democracy Policy at Indivisible. Hi, Meagan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. So I wanted to start by asking just a little bit about you and how you got involved in politics. I assume, when you went to law school, Indivisible wasn't a thing yet. So
No.
How did you sort of end up where you are?
Yeah, no, when I went to law school, things were, inequitable, but not completely broken. That was back in 2010. So no, Indivisible didn't exist yet. I think, for me, it's been kind of an interesting journey into politics. I really started out wanting to be a public defender. And I had, as a law student, you're allowed to practice to a certain degree with supervision from your professors. So I did have some clients when I was in law school who were in crisis, and I really felt like that was something I really wanted to do. And then when I graduated from law school, and many people graduating from law school this year can probably identify with this, the economy was bad. It was very bad. So I took the first job I could get, which was in Washington, D.C. It was actually writing about the law. So it kind of like weaved my way to the Hill from there. And I worked for Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is the non-voting delegate for the District of Columbia in the House of Representatives, which was super interesting. And then worked on judicial nominations for a while, and then ended up at Indivisible, where we're trying to make democracy function a little bit better if we can.
Yeah. So Indivisible is probably bigger than a lot of people realize. What is the Director of Democracy Policy? What does that role look like?
Yeah, it's messy, just like democracy is. I think there's like kind of some core tenets to what a functioning democracy looks like. Obviously, voting is a big part of it. Campaign finance is a huge part of it. Actually, how the media functions in a democracy is critically important too, and how those institutions actually work. Making sure that the Senate is representative of the country as a whole, which currently it is not. Making sure that it's not being kind of completely taken over by sort of a shrinking ideological minority of people. And then, of course, the courts are one of the most critical parts of a functioning democracy. And speaking of things that are broken, the courts are a really hot mess at the moment.
Yes.
For anyone who may have remembered the Brett Kavanaugh fight in 2018, it's even worse. It's even worse than that. Donald Trump has confirmed he hit Judge 200 last week. So he's been able to confirm 200 judges to the federal bench. That's a lot of judges. It's almost a record number of judges. And those judges serve on the bench forever. They serve on the bench for life. So even after Donald Trump has gone away, his judges will remain on the bench. Very scary.
Sorry, listeners, if you weren't having a panic attack.
Yeah, I know. My coworkers hate it when I talk about the courts because it's like one of the most critical, but also one of the scariest parts of our democracy work, because it's going to take so much work to kind of shift the tide kind of away from very hardcore conservatism back to a more reasonable path. So yeah, we're working on it, though.
While we're on the topic of courts, there have been a bunch of Supreme Court decisions that have come out in recent weeks. And I believe you were quoted in the New York Times as saying something like the court's not always evil, but usually is. So how do we look at this Supreme Court and some of these decisions that on their face have seemed like they're going the right way? And, but how do we view this system? Obviously the Republicans have been running on the Supreme Court for a very long time and Democrats haven't. And, how do we need to think about this?
Yeah. So I'll start with what's been going on this year. I mean, I think, like you just said, on their face, it seems like things have been going pretty okay. I mean, they didn't strike down DACA. They said that you cannot discriminate against LGBTQ people in employment. That's good. They overturned a horrendous Louisiana abortion law that would have restricted abortions almost completely. And so on the face of it, it's like, well, is the court so bad? Like, why do I really have to care about this? 3 good cases, and I'll take them. I'll take the 3 good cases. That doesn't undo the decades of damage that this court has done to our democracy under John Roberts specifically. And you can see it every time there's a primary election in this country. If anyone listening to this has had to wait in line in the South for 7 or 8 hours to vote, that is because individually and specifically because of John Roberts. He gutted the Voting Rights Act. He said, things have changed in the South. That's a quote unquote, things have changed in the South. We don't need to have this law that protects Black people and people of color's right to vote in these states that have very long histories of racial discrimination. It's all fine now. It's all good. So we're going to gut it. And you can draw a straight line from that to the very long lines you're seeing, not just in the South, but in Wisconsin also. And straight line from that to Stacey Abrams not being able to pull out a victory over Brian Kemp in Georgia last year in 2018. That's because this Supreme Court is itself an anti-democratic institution. That means none of the people on the bench were elected to that position, but they also hinder participation in democracy by making it more difficult for people to vote and making it easier for dark money and big corporate donations to flood the system. So yes, it's very good that they found that LGBTQ people can't be discriminated against at work. Yes, it's good that they ultimately said, this abortion law, these abortion restrictions in Louisiana are bad and have to be struck down. But this court is not done yet. There's a lot of damage still left to be done. I think they're still waiting for kind of the perfect abortion case to get where they can really go after it the way they want to. So I think people should be cautious when heaping too much praise on the Supreme Court. Because, like I said, the Supreme Court is not evil 100% of the time, but they are evil like 93% of the time, 94% of the time.
Seems like a bad sign when you're thinking of Roberts as the swing vote.
It's a very bad sign, and it's an incredibly bad sign. And I think, and honestly, at the end of the day, it's like, the court can function in such a way where you basically don't even have to know that it's there. Yeah. But how it operates now is every June, we all bite our fingernails down to the nub, freaking out that the court is going to do something bad. Like, it doesn't actually have to be that way. And the reason that it is like that is because of the ideological split is 5-4. So yes, they did the right thing 3 times in June, but 1, that does not change what they've done in the past. And 2, we shouldn't have to think about the court that way, like hoping and praying that one of them does the right thing. It shouldn't have to be like that.
All right, so I want to talk about DC statehood. So a little less than 2 weeks ago, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 51, the bill for DC statehood, and this was historic. They hadn't voted before. Mm-hmm. So let's start with, why is DC not a state already?
Yeah, that's a long and kind of wonderful, that's a beautiful question with a long and kind of wonderful answer. So it goes way back to our founding. Originally, the capital of the United States was in Philadelphia, which of course is in a state, it's in Pennsylvania. There was some sort of kerfuffle involving Revolutionary War veterans who had not yet received their pensions that they were owed. And so they did sort of like a soft coup kind of where they kind of teamed up with Pennsylvania militias or something like this and basically blocked the representatives from being able to leave the Capitol. So of course, I don't know, I think John Adams was in there like, oh my God, we can't let this happen ever again. We have to find a neutral place for the Capitol to exist. It cannot be a state. It has to be its own thing with like exclusive federal jurisdiction, which means that the states would not be able to interfere with our business. We'd be able to have exclusive control over everything that happens in this district. So they got some land from Maryland and they got a little bit from Virginia, and they created the District of Columbia, which was purely a federal district. Nobody was ever intended to actually live there, but of course people do. They did and they do. So this was never supposed to be a place. It was never supposed to be a district that denied, representation or voting rights to people, because no one was really anticipated to ever actually live there. So that's kind of how it started. That's why it didn't start out as a state. But the reason that it isn't a state now is kind of like a longer and a little bit more of a racist journey, which I am happy to talk to you about. Basically, what happened after that was, fast forward like 100 years, Lincoln actually emancipated Black slaves in the district about 9 months before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So DC very quickly became a place full of free Black people, and it became a very attractive place for free Black people from other areas to come live, or escaped slaves to go where they could go live and be free. So very quickly, the demographics of DC became mostly Black, and that it was true for hundreds of years after. And DC used to be called Chocolate City because it was a majority Black city. And that very obviously and very plainly became the reason why Congress continued to deny representation to DC, even after it became clear that this federal district was becoming a place where people actually lived and worked. Like, there's very explicit examples of members of Congress saying, we cannot grant political power to the people living in the city because they are Black. We do not want Black people to have that kind of power. This is hundreds of years ago, but even up to the 1960s, our mayor sent the budget to Congress. Congress has to approve DC's budget. Still, that is true. And in response, a Southern member of Congress sent a crate of watermelons to City Hall, to our Black mayor. So it's very obviously racially motivated why DC has been denied political power for so long. So maybe it started out with some sort of legitimate concern about federal authority, and then it very quickly morphed into a way to oppress Black people, or to undermine Black people's political power in the federal government.
So you mentioned that the budget needs to be approved by Congress. How else does the governing of DC happen? What are the things that are affected by not being in its own state?
Yeah, it's messy, and it oftentimes depends. The level with which the federal government will interfere with our local processes really depends on who the president is. So when the president is a Democrat, they usually leave us alone. And when the president is a Republican, they usually don't. They usually mess with us. The budget thing is kind of interesting. We have to, and this is our local money. Just want to make that really clear. This is locally raised DC money. Like our local sales tax, our local income tax. This is all money we raise in the district. None of this is federal money. We send that to Congress, and Congress can decide whether or not they approve it. And they can also add what are called riders to the money, which is restrictions on what we can spend the money on. So for decades, they have prevented us from using that money to provide funding for low-income people to get abortions or to get reproductive health care. So we can't use our local money for that. Recently, they banned us from using our local money to commercialize marijuana. So we have this very funky marijuana system in DC where it's legal to possess marijuana, but no one in the city can spend any money to actually tax it and get the revenue from the sale of marijuana. So it kind of created this bizarre black market where you can buy something like a painting or something, and then you get a free gift, and then the free gift is marijuana. So it's very strange. So that's all because of congressional interference. Otherwise, if we were a state, we could just commercialize it, like the exact same way Colorado has done. We could be making millions of dollars on marijuana sales, but we can't do that. We're banned from doing that. Some of the more viscerally upsetting ways, I think people probably have seen this in the news, that the federal government can mess with us. So this is a federal jurisdiction. We have a local police force, but there's also law enforcement from pretty much every governmental agency you can imagine, not to mention military personnel. So just a few weeks ago, when folks first started going out for the Black Lives Matter protests for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, they were protesting in Lafayette Square, which is this park right across the street from the White House, peacefully protesting. Trump has the authority to send in federal law enforcement officers and military personnel to clear out that park. And that's what he did. He sent them in, They used extremely violent means to clear out this park, tear gas and like physical violence to clear it out. And that includes members of the military clearing out American citizens who were like exercising their First Amendment rights, just so we could go get a photo opportunity in this park. Now, in a state like wherever, Illinois, let's say, if the president tried to send in federal troops, the state could turn them away and say, I reject your use of force here. They can refuse to allow federal troops to come in at the president's urging. They have to say yes. In DC, we don't have that right. We have no authority to turn them away because we are under exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government. So it's, like I said, when a Democrat is president, it's not any different than living anywhere else. But when a Republican is president, not to mention Donald Trump, who is, the way that he is, it's a lot scarier because at any moment he could send military troops to an otherwise very peaceful protest. And we really have no say. We have no authority to say, we don't want this here because the federal government is in charge.
So what would things look like under HR 51? There would still be a federal district of some sort, but the surrounding city would become a state. So what are some of the things, sort of play this out? What does it look like if it becomes a state?
Yes, well, it would be small by square footage, but it would not be small by population. There are about 700,000 people that live here, which is more than Wyoming, and I think Vermont, last time I checked. So we would have more people living here than some other states, but it would be small. Nobody's denying that. But yes, it would basically shrink the federal district down from its current boundaries, which is the entire District of Columbia, down into a very small federal district that would just include the Capitol complex, so like the House and Senate buildings, the National Mall, the White House, and some other federal buildings that are in kind of that same general area. So it would very specifically be federal government functions only. So all the parts of DC where people actually live, that would become a state. And 700,000 of us would finally have a voting representative in the House, and we'd get 2 senators in the Senate. So we'd finally have a say over like judicial nominations and how our tax dollars should be spent and things like that. And we'd be free from congressional interference. So everything I just mentioned, they block us from using our money to commercialize marijuana. They block us from using our money to provide healthcare to people. We would finally be able to do that. So we actually would be able to generate a lot more tax revenue than we are able to do now, which is interesting because that's like a very common red herring that Republicans put forth, like, oh, DC can't be a state. It's too small. They don't have enough in tax revenue. And it's like, well, yeah, because you're blocking us from raising taxes. So I think, I don't have any concerns that it would be a small and yet mighty and thriving state, I think, if given the opportunity.
And what would it be called?
It would be called Washington Douglas Commonwealth, named after Frederick Douglass, who was just a hero to DC and to the region and was in favor of autonomy and representation for the district, even, back when he was alive. So it's an homage to him. Originally, it was going to be called the New Columbia, but I think that the postal code ran into problems because NC is already taken by North Carolina. But anyways, everybody liked Douglas Commonwealth better anyway. So that's what we voted on. And that's what people seem to like.
So I think sometimes when people talk about DC being a state, they bring up Puerto Rico as well. But DC, in addition to the House having voted on it, DC was much further in the process, right? What would be the sort of differences why DC makes sense at this point in ways that Puerto Rico doesn't necessarily?
Yeah, I think a critical part of becoming a state is self-determination is the key, whether you're talking about DC or whether you're talking about Puerto Rico or really any place else. In fact, like when lots of other states before they became states, they had to come to Congress and let them know, not only do we want to be a state, but this is what all the people who live in this jurisdiction want too. Like that's how Tennessee became a state. They petitioned Congress and they had to show that there was popular support for statehood in Tennessee. And that's what DC did too. We took a vote we had a referendum. 86% of the people who voted supported the referendum to make DC a state. Now, Puerto Rico is a little bit different. They've had a couple different statehood votes. And the last time they did one, statehood got a plurality of the vote, so a little bit over a third. But two other options, one was not statehood and one was something else, got more of the vote than statehood did. So while it got a plurality, if it was like a real election, it would have won, it didn't really get like a mandate in the same way that the DC statehood referendum did. So what we say is we support self-determination for Puerto Rico. That means they get to decide what they want for themselves. And right now, it's not clear that statehood is what Puerto Rico wants. It could be they want to become their own country. It could be that they do want to become a state. It could be that they want to keep the status quo. It's completely up to them. And until there is, I think, a very clear mandate that that's what Puerto Rico wants, that statehood is what Puerto Rico wants, I think it's in everyone's best interest to kind of not try to impose from the mainland something onto them that they have not necessarily embraced yet.
Mm-hmm. So what is the next step for DC? Is there any chance this gets through the Senate?
Not this year, no. I think, I'm just going to be honest. Mitch McConnell has called DC statehood full-bore socialism. That is also a direct quote.
Representation is socialism.
Yes, yes, that's correct. Voting rights for, I think, people of color in particular is socialism, according to Mitch McConnell. So that is not happening. It passed the House, but it is not going to get taken up in the Senate. A lot of Republican senators have made their feelings clear on this. Lindsey Graham, for one, has said it's unfair to South Carolina. It would dilute South Carolina's vote, that sort of thing. A lot of dog whistle type of arguments against statehood. So that's not happening this year. So the goal is to get every single Democrat on the Senate version of the bill as a co-sponsor before the end of this year, so that we can go into 2021 with a lot of momentum for DC statehood. And that's assuming kind of an ideal scenario where Democrats win back the White House, win back the Senate, and then we can go into 2021 with like a very strong foundation of support for statehood and really make that happen ideally within the first 100 days of the next administration and the next Congress.
And how quickly would that go into effect?
It would take some time. I think there would be a lot of disentangling of federal and local DC relationships. It would take some time to disentangle that. And also it would definitely be challenged in the courts. One of the arguments that Republicans make is that DC statehood is unconstitutional because the Constitution says there has to be a federal district. I don't buy that argument. I think the bill just shrinks the federal district down. It doesn't violate the Constitution to do that. But nevertheless, it would very likely be challenged in court, and that would take some time to sort out. Ideally, we would emerge victorious by the end of 2021 or something like that, but who knows? And with the Supreme Court, who knows for sure exactly how they would decide or how long it would take, but it would take some time to figure out. But it would be a great problem to have that the DC statehood bill passed both chambers of Congress and was signed into law by the president. I would love to have that problem,
And so it would add 2 senators. What would happen to the House of Representatives?
Probably nothing. I think we would still just have the one representative. Roughly, I think right now the ratio is 1 representative for about every 600,000 or so people. And so that would basically stay the same. The only difference would be that person would finally get to actually vote. So one of the ironies of the DC statehood bill floor vote that happened on the June 26th, my old boss, Eleanor Holmes Norton, introduced it, fought, like hell to get this thing passed on the House floor. And she herself did not get to vote on the bill. She does not have a vote on the House floor. So that would be the biggest change, would be that she would actually have a vote going forward on the House floor.
What should everyone do in support of DC statehood? Should we be calling our senators? How should, or just really working hard to win in November?
Yes, both. No, it's very unlikely if folks are listening and you have a Republican senator, extremely, extremely unlikely that that person will, flout Mitch McConnell and join the DC Statehood bill as a co-sponsor. But if you have a Democratic senator, there are a few that are currently not on it, which include Doug Jones, Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema. Those three, for sure, are not co-sponsors of the bill. So the goal would be to get every single Democrat as a co-sponsor on the DC Statehood bill, so that we can, like I said, so we can have that momentum going into the next administration, into the next Congress, with a lot of support for DC Statehood. But in the meantime, really, the goal is to have a better Senate. And that means making sure Mitch McConnell isn't the Senate Majority Leader in January 2021.
Yes, that'd be great.
That would be fantastic. I would love that. Just a small gift for me. That would be great.
Last question for you, and this is unrelated to DC Statehood, is when I was looking you up, I found a piece you'd written 7 years ago now about the Cheerios ad that had a biracial family. So I was just wondering, has representation in media gotten any better in the past 7 years since you wrote that? Especially, are there more biracial families being shown on TV? Do you feel like that has changed at all?
Yeah, I do. That's so interesting. I haven't thought about that piece in a long time. I haven't read it. I maybe have read it a couple times since I wrote it. And when I think about it now, it's not that I regret it, but I think I would write it differently now. I think at the time I was under the false impression that having your existence validated by a corporation was really important. I mean, to a certain degree it is, right? Like, representation does matter. It is important. It is a thing, but it's not the only thing. And what I have actually noticed over the past 7 years is that it's almost like in vogue almost to use an interracial family in an ad or on a TV show, as though that is kind of a symbol of equality. Like, that the fact that these two people are together now is like, see, the problem is solved. Like, that's the solution to the problem, is people marrying outside of their race. And so I guess if I had to write it again, I would say, it's nice to see yourself reflected on TV, but at the end of the day, these companies just want to sell you stuff. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so it's like, so I think I was just so stunned. Just because I'd literally never seen it before, and it was really nice. But now I feel like I see it so much, it feels almost cynical. Like, the use of like biracial kids or interracial families feels a little bit more cynical to me. And I don't know exactly how to reconcile that with what I wrote all those years ago. I mean, and like I said, I think representation is incredibly important. It really does matter. Like, that is, in a lot of ways, that is how you are validated, is through popular representations of who you are. But to the extent that, there's always that creeping cynicism that, like, what this really is about is trying to get you to buy something, that kind of taints the whole thing for me, I guess.
Do you think that maybe having that as a starting point, though, that there is representation, so that doesn't have to be something that people are looking for, that allows them the space then to be focused on bigger, more important issues, like how we're treating people of different races, do we have justice, that maybe, part of this sort of Gen Z coming up and sort of fighting for things is because they don't have to be worried about sort of the base level of representation.
Yeah, I think that's true to a certain extent. I also, this is just my cynical brain coming in again too, is I think that is true. And I am very envious of, like, I've been really addicted to TikTok since we all went into quarantine, and, like, the kids on there are so funny, and they're just so immediately accepting of things that are different from them in a way that, like, I definitely wasn't when I was growing up. And so I'm very envious of that fact. But I think what I've noticed, this is not exactly answering your question, what I've noticed is sometimes that's used, like the representation piece is kind of used as a way to say, like, it's just a way to check something off a box, if I could put it that way, where, especially I think after, where I've noticed it the most is after all of these Black Lives Matter protests, and I would say that this feels very different even than past Black Lives Matter protests that we've all lived through. It does seem that corporations are paying a lot more attention to these uprisings than I have ever seen in the past. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. The way I've seen it manifest so far is, we're going to take certain episodes of TV shows off of streaming services. And it's like, yeah, but what else are you going to do? Like, is that it? Or so I think to a certain extent, it's like it kind of, the representation thing kind of cuts both ways, where it's very good. And I think it lets people see a vision of what life is like outside of what is like familiar to them. But it's also a way for big companies to say, well, I did the right thing. I put a Black person on the show, or I put an interracial family on the show, or I took off the offensive episode of the show off of Hulu, including an episode of Golden Girls where they were just wearing like a mud mask. It's like, that was not even offensive. I think that one was actually okay. And so on the one hand, I do think it frees up Gen Z to be worried about like the bigger structural problems. But on the other hand, I'd be wary of corporations pretending as though representation is the solution to the structural problem. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at here, which I think some of them do. Some corporations do that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So corporations, if you're listening, and you're probably not, fight for DC statehood instead.
Yes, fight for DC statehood and hire Black women to be on your board.
Yes. For all the many corporations that I'm sure are listening to this.
Hello, Clorox.
Well, Meagan, how can people follow you if they want to hear more from you and what you're doing with Indivisible?
Well, I would be honored. I am on Twitter, even though it's hard some days to be on Twitter, but I am on Twitter, and people can follow me at Important Meagan, and my name is spelled Meagan.
Excellent. We'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So, Meagan, thank you so much for talking with me today, and for being gracious when I turned the conversation in an unexpected direction.
No worries at all.
But it was really great to talk to you, and I really, 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 really hope that we are successful in the next year in getting DC statehood.
Me too, and thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.